Do you know how the orcs first came into being? Well, last Orctober, I was inspired by this meme to make a baby orc out of a baby Yoda. Look at my son. Pride is not the word I'm looking for. Actually, that's a lie. I'm very proud of him. His name is Grognach. As this Orctober approached, I started getting excited about the idea of making a baby Uruk-Hai. The group that captures Merry and Pippin wears leather armor, which was enough of a reason for me to abandon Reason for Madness and buy another Grogu. First up, of course, is the dismemberment.
You do not know pain, you do not know fear. You will taste rotten flesh.
I'm so cute and cuddly. Please don't dismember me. Okay, so I think we're gonna cut off the ears. Looks like meat's back on the menu, boy. I've committed crimes. Don't try this at home, kids. So I think there's a possibility that I could just stick these in here to use them. Oh my god, this is cursed. That's very Spock-like. I don't know how I feel about that. The head's just attached on with a zip tie. I wanted to create a different head profile, so I glued the ear tips back on with hot glue. Not totally crazy, right? Then it was clay time. I used air dry Sculpey, which kind of sucks, but works okay for orc skin, especially with lots of texture added to conceal all the crimes. I completely covered the ears and then the back and the top of the head. I let that dry so I could handle it and then moved on to the face. At some point I switched to a new package, which was a different color for some reason. I don't know. I used some styluses to create texture and shape the face. All right, here's the current status on the clay. I don't know how I feel about it. I'm just gonna leave this to dry for several days. I painted the head a solid gray color, which served the dual purpose of priming it and letting me see if I was happy with the texture with a solid color. It took multiple coats of various colors, sprinkled with an existential crisis, until I was happy with the result. You know that feeling when you're a 42-year-old delicately painting eyeliner on a baby Uruk-Hai, and you suddenly wonder what happened in your life to lead you to this moment? All right, so the current situation is I have him mostly painted. I need to put his hair on before I progress too much further. Hair. I bought the cheapest wig I could find for $4 at the dollar store. Who is she? After much shenanigans, I deconstructed it and made a bunch of dreadlocks. Each dread took a solid 10 minutes to make. I trimmed the lace, sewed it back together, stitched the dreadlocks onto the head, then I glued the lace to his head. Underneath there's a mound of foam to create some volume. I googled how to make a wig less shiny, which is how I ended up dry shampooing his hair. Then I cut some layers and tied his hair back because this baby Uruk-Hai has hobbits to capture, alive and unspoiled, and he needs his hair out of his face to get stuff done.
Do you wear wigs?
No, I do not.
Have you worn wigs?
No, I have not.
Will you wear?
Body yada 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 yada. Because the clay is so heavy, his body needs more weight so it doesn't tip over. So I filled a Starbucks cup with rocks and some stuffing. I pulled out his innards. You do not know pain. You do not know fear. I cut a lid from an old cutting mat and taped it to the cup. I filled around the cup with his leftover innards so he's still nice and soft. Then I stitched up the neck, added his head. My son has arrived. And then I painted his arms to match his hands. Clothing. I started by making him a little leather jerkin, which is basically the same as the one I made for Aragorn, but extra tiny. I even used the same pigskin suede that I'd bought for the Aragorn trim. I cut the leather out, punched holes with an awl, and hand stitched it together at the back and at the shoulders. Then I added top stitching at the back for the aesthetic. Then I punched holes at the front and the sides to lace it up. So I have made what is basically a miniature Aragorn jerkin, essentially. This is so silly. Instead of sleeves, I glued bits of leather to the shoulders to create the messy sleeve look. Then I hacked away at the bottom with a skiver and an X-Acto knife, tearing the leather up and making it all orcish. Then I realized his jerkin didn't adequately hide his thunder, so I made him what is basically ended up being a skirt out of the fabric left over from a reindeer. I gathered the fabric and stitched it to a piece of ribbon to tie it around his waist. Armor. I patterned the armor on paper first, which took me quite a long time. I'm very fortunate that a decade ago someone bequeathed a giant bin of leather scraps to me. So I dug through my leather archives and pulled out some brown scraps in the sizes that I needed. Then I cut the pieces out of veg tan cowhide and more leather scraps. I punched all the holes. As usual, I wildly underestimated how long this was gonna take. Here's the debris. So I need 7 buckles total, and I was gonna make all of them, and then I realize that's ridiculous because these ones aren't even going to be visible. For his belt buckle, I used a metal buckle as a base and covered it with clay and then painted it with acrylic. The armor and cuff buckles were so tiny that I decided to make them out of cardboard. I covered the cardboard in a few layers of Mod Podge to round the shape and make them slightly more substantial. Then I painted them with acrylic. Okay, so I've got 4 of these for the armor. Then of course the belt buckle one. Dyed the leather with brown dye. My usual problem is being too dark, but this time I went the other direction, and now that it's dry, I see it's too light, so I'm going back in with the dye. And used Resin to seal it. While the finish was still damp, I stabbed and scrunched the leather to create a weathered look. Then I used some leather antique to highlight the scratches and sealed it one last time. I hand-stitched the collar and the front patches. These chest patches are so odd, they serve no function that I can see besides looking really cool as dangly bits. And then I riveted all the separate pieces together. Fun fact, the meme that started it all talks about Gollum eating baby orcs and human babies. It is in fact Tolkien canon that Gollum ate babies. Here's a direct quote from Fellowship of the Ring. The woodsman said that there was some new terror abroad, a ghost that drank blood. It climbed trees to find nests. It crept into holes to find the young. It slipped through windows to find cradles. So there you go. Gollum ate babies. It's time to attach the small. The ones for the cuffs are even more small. I realized I punched the buckle at the wrong end because the pointy bit was supposed to be at this end. Derp. Oh well. Mistakes were made. Attaching the buckles was super awkward as they are so tiny. Okay, that's not the worst. That worked. Accessories. I made him a small flask to keep his grog. I hand-stitched it out of suede, punched some holes, and added a cork I made out of clay. Later, I painted the cork. For his scimitar, I covered a small dowel in clay. I smoothed the clay out as best I could, let it dry, and then sanded it, painted it with multiple colors, and added a strip of leather to the handle with glue. I had some chains and spikes left over from making my first baby orc, so I joined those together. Weathering. Once I had the front and the back armor assembled, I weathered everything with orc blood. Really, it was black, gray, and brown acrylic paints, and I also used a lot of texture sand mixed in. Gloves. Very important. I weathered all his layers, his orc accessories, and his hair. I love weathering so much, and it's so fun to think about the ways that something would become dirty. Obviously, mud and dust is going to collect along the bottom. Sweat would collect around his neck, his armpits. Anywhere that there are seams are going to collect sweat and dust. I always make sure to get lots of grime down into the little indents and the holes and then wipe it off of the surface. I used a lot of watered down black acrylic paint, dabbed it into all of the corners, and then wiped the excess off of the surface so that it left some grime down in the indent. Finally, it was time to get dressed. First, I put on his loincloth skirt situation thing. Then I laced up his suede jerkin. His belt feeds through the back of the jerkin, so I added that and then buckled his armor on. Since the buckles aren't actually functional, I used glue to hold them closed. I used glue to attach his cuffs and the cuff buckles as well. I tied the chain danglies around his waist, glued in some feathers, and added a bone necklace. Then I added his collar and laced it up, did up his belt. I tied his grog flask to his belt, and then did some final weathering to tie it all together. And here's Gorgluk, my baby Uruk-Hai. Whom do you serve? See here for the baby orc I made last year, and follow for more nerdy projects.